Hello, healing souls. My name is Dawn, and I am a survivor of depression and complex PTSD. Welcome to my channel, where I help to support those working through trauma, depression, and other mental health issues. In today's video, we will discuss the types of trauma responses we might experience. Regardless of if an individual experiences early childhood trauma, our fight or flight response is hardwired into our nervous system, designed to keep us safe. Think running away from a fire or fighting back if you were attacked by a dog. The body's physiological response is designed to keep us safe from anything physically or mentally overwhelming. The release of adrenaline and other hormones assists us in moving away from whatever that might be. For trauma survivors, our trauma responses are our reactions to early life trauma and are generally much more easily triggered than they are for others. Again, they were designed to keep us safe in the face of overwhelming circumstances our young minds weren't capable of processing. Most people have one or two responses that they turn to when conflict or any other seemingly threatening situation comes up. A trauma response can happen through any and all relationships, even work and friendship relationships. The situation where a trauma response appears doesn't necessarily have to be a threatening situation. It can also occur when we are already emotionally dysregulated. Let's look at the first trauma response of fight. Let's say your coworker said that they'd respond to your email by the end of the day. It was something important that you needed to complete a report that you have due, but they didn't get back to you. Then, on the way home from work, someone cuts you off in traffic without using their blinker. You had plenty of room so that you weren't in any danger of an accident, but it was enough to add to your growing frustration. You go home, and your husband had said he'd have dinner ready when you got home. However, a friend of his needed a ride home to get jumper cables after their car battery died. So now you've had three things go, quote, wrong in a short amount of time. You feel angry and like you want to yell after so much frustration because you're feeling emotionally dysregulated from those three things. So when your husband gets home, you let him have it by yelling, "I am sick and tired of you always telling me you're going to do something and you never follow through." Your husband responds and explains what happened. Your response is, "Oh, okay, I see. So Brian is more important than taking care of me." Now, of course, this isn't true, but your sense of safety, surety, and security feels as if it's been threatened by multiple tiny things. Maybe you feel like your husband has been pretty distant lately, and this is just the last straw. So you use all these little things to switch into fight mode to alleviate the emotional dysregulation that is occurring in your body. Your reaction is much bigger than the situation really warrants. And now, due to moving into your trauma response of fight mode, there is repair needed in your spousal relationship. The fight trauma response is when we get big. We want to discharge the emotional dysregulation in our bodies, so we fight whatever the perceived threat is. In our relationships, this can often look like yelling, bullying, and expecting others to back down to our reactions so we feel in control of the situation. Feeling back in control makes us feel safe. And even though it may discharge this uncomfortable energy in our body short term, it typically causes issues in our relationships. Trauma response number 2, flight. This is when we want to physically remove ourselves as quickly as possible from the perceived threat. Our sense of safety here is created by leaving the situation as soon and as fast as we can. In order to emotionally regulate, we want to run away. As an example, let's say you get home from work. Your roommate is upset that you forgot to pay the electric bill and there is a disconnect notice on the table. He begins to raise his voice at you and says, "This is the third time in a row this has happened. We talked about this and you promised it wouldn't happen again." You try to explain that due to a lot of overtime hours at work, you forgot to pay it. And your roommate continues to escalate the conversation, talking fast and telling you it's irresponsible and maybe you need to move out if you can't follow through and pay your bills. Immediately, you feel your trauma response flight kick in. You are perceiving being attacked by your roommate due to the criticism and the perceived threat of having to move out. This reminds you of when your father used to berate you for mistakes and then he would spank you. Your nervous system kicks in and you want to flee the conversation and the flood of feelings that this is creating in your body. You want to alleviate the feelings as soon as possible, so you say to your roommate, "I have to go to the store." Although you just walked back in from the house from work, you immediately leave while your roommate continues to berate you from behind, saying, "You always leave when I try to talk to you about this stuff." Without a word, you close the door and try to get your breath back in your car, knowing the conversation still awaits you when you get back. But at least for the moment, you can re regulate yourself back to a sense of safety since you took flight from the situation. The challenge with this response is the relief that we feel is only temporary. Trauma response number 3, freeze. This trauma response is when the situation is so overwhelming that we essentially freeze in place, either physically or mentally, due to feeling unsafe. As a survivor of domestic violence, this was one of my trauma responses. I was always terrified when the violence would begin in my home, especially since I had no idea when it would start and when or how it would end. I often froze in place in hopes that I would go unnoticed and keep myself safe by not being the person that the violence would be turned toward. Other forms of freeze responses can look like having brain fog and not being able to answer questions, not remembering conversations with people who are threatening us, or actual disassociation from our body, where we mentally check out, feeling disconnected from our body and floaty. People might ask us later, "Don't you remember when I said XYZ?" And you won't remember the conversation or the incident at all. I feel this is why many trauma survivors don't remember much of their childhood, especially if it was particularly fraught with a lot of abuse or domestic violence. It's the body and the brain's way of protecting us from our feelings of fear. Let's use the same example where the woman came home from work already emotionally dysregulated. Only in this example, the husband has a trauma response. In childhood, as a drinker, his mom would scream at him whenever he would make a mistake or upset her. She would often get violent with him. He might have had actual physical harm done to him that left marks on his body. So now, when his wife gets angry and yells, his body responds in the same way that it did as a child. He will freeze and check out. She might ask him questions and he either stammers or can't answer them because his nervous system is on overload. Then she escalates the fighting because he's not answering her. She might call him names or swear at him. And now he dissociates. He becomes floaty in his body the same way he did as a little boy. Until she stops yelling or he's able to get to another room, he will stay unaware of his surroundings. When he allows himself to be back in his body, he might only remember pieces of what happened or the conversation with his wife. Trauma response number 4, fawn. The fawn response is when we try to either preemptively avoid trauma by gaining someone's favor or appeasing them and people pleasing. Let's look at what that might look like. Using a husband-wife example again, let's say that the husband woke up in a bad mood due to lack of sleep. He was obviously cranky, and his wife knew that meant he might come home later in a bad mood. Then his anger would get out of control, as it so often did. So before he left, she said, "Honey, maybe we can go out for dinner to your favorite restaurant tonight when we get home." She feels responsible for getting him back into a good mood to protect herself from anger later that day. He responds with, "Why do you always want to spend money when you know I'm trying to save for a new car for myself?" Realizing that tactic didn't work and, in fact, might have made things worse, she backs down. "You're right, honey. I'm sorry. That was thoughtless of me. You always take such good care of me." She's trying to appease him and make herself the problem. So she decides, instead of working out that evening like she wanted, she will make his favorite meal for dinner and hope that that avoids any anger problems, especially since they just had one last night. However, he gets home 45 minutes late and she says, "I made beef tips and rice, your favorite, for dinner." His response is, "I had a crappy day at work, so I stopped off for dinner with the guys." Then, without another word, he goes into the living room and switches on the TV. She doesn't bring up the fact that he didn't call to let her know he'd be going out to eat, or that he spent money he said he didn't want to. And so she pushes down her feelings of anger and frustration. She knows there's no point in bringing them up since that would just make her husband upset again, and that's the last thing she wants. In my home, I was often the one to try to make my mom happy when I could tell that she was emotionally upset herself. I found that if I constantly told my mom I loved her, sometimes multiple times a day, that would put her in a good mood. As mentioned, most people use one or two learned trauma responses when they are triggered, but we can turn to others depending on the situation. My two biggest trauma responses when I was little were freeze and fawn. Now, as an adult, I find myself still utilizing these, but I often can turn to flight more than freeze since I am able to leave the situation as an adult. As I have healed from trauma, learning to emotionally regulate has been a big part of my recovery. I have had to learn that the people and situations in my life are not the same type of threat that I had in my childhood. Over time, I have worked on my trauma responses in a few different ways. The response to freeze has involved me learning to answer questions when someone is upset with me and to understand that conflict in a relationship is healthy and does not mean I am under physical threat. For my fawn response, I have had to learn to set boundaries, not people please, and own my needs and wants versus always worrying about what others want and expect so that I can stay safe. I have also had to learn that other people's feelings and responses have nothing to do with me, that I am not responsible for appeasing them to protect myself because I'm no longer a child. My feelings matter too. Some suggestions to learn emotional regulation techniques are utilizing mindfulness and meditation, breathing techniques, EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing, and a treatment called dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. DBT was instrumental in helping me learn emotional regulation and how to effectively express my feelings and needs versus appeasing others, as well as calming my fight or flight response. Trauma survivors need to learn in the moment emotional regulation techniques, and DBT is excellent for this. Once we learn emotional regulation for our at that moment trauma responses, then if we are experiencing ongoing stress, to avoid emotional dysregulation, things such as art, painting, Tai Chi, and exercise are excellent support for remaining regulated on an ongoing basis. I will go into some of these suggestions in future videos, so if you would like to learn more about that, please hit the subscribe button. I'd like to share a resource for you. One exceptional book I read during recovery and understanding myself better was Pete Walker's Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving book. He goes in depth into each of the trauma responses, as well as how to move through things like an inner critic that is often the voice we heard in our head as a child, whether that is from a caregiver or the shame we internalized as our feelings of not enoughness that we now turn on ourselves as an adult. I cannot recommend this book enough. As I said earlier, I want to remind you that some of these trauma responses can happen even in everyday occurrences, such as a meeting with the boss, being pulled over by a police officer for speeding, or even smelling a food from childhood that we had a traumatic experience around. It doesn't have to involve conflict or a relationship argument. It can be anything that we experience as a trigger or a threat to our safety, no matter how benign it might be to another person. Again, this is part of what a trauma response is. It is an unexpected or larger than might be expected response to stimuli. I hope you found some understanding in this video of what your trauma responses might be. Please understand these are nothing to be ashamed of. They are understandable reactions to what were difficult experiences. I want to assure you they can be healed. Sending you healing souls so much love, and for whoever needs to hear this, you matter.